I'm Sam, I'm a graphic designer, and today we're going to talk about how to balance your brand color palettes. This is a little bit of art and a little bit of science, so I'm going to show you how to do the artistic, creative side of this, but I'm also going to show you how to use science, aka using the color spectrum and understanding how it works to balance your palettes to make sure that they not only look amazing, but that they're actually usable and accessible. This is going to be really fun. Now, when it comes to color palettes, there are two main characters. There's aesthetics and there's balance. Aesthetic is essentially the vibe of the brand. So like, what's the overall design style, vibe, energy? And there are lots of different examples. I mean, there are infinite examples. Like eclectic grandpa is a really popular example right now. But here are some examples of vibes or aesthetics that your brand direction can go in. It could be bright and warm. It could be retro 70s, pastel. Essentially, this is like how your brand feels, what the vibe is. But we're not going to be talking too much about aesthetics today. We're going to talk more about balance, which is how well the color palette actually functions. And when we talk about a palette functioning, what we're really talking about is color contrast. Color contrast measures the difference between any two colors. So in its rawest sense, contrast just measures difference. So like a real life example of color contrast is that my sweater is light blue and the wall is like a bright darker blue. So there's good contrast between me and the wall. If I had on a navy sweater, it might blend in with the wall. So that would be low contrast. Now this might feel really basic, but when we talk about color contrast, we need to be talking about two colors. You can't ever measure the color contrast of one color because it's measuring the difference between two separate colors. And there's so much that I want to talk about when it comes to color contrast, but I'm going to make it really simple for this video. The yardstick that I'm going to be using for this presentation is defined by the WCAG, which is the Website Content and Accessibility Guidelines, a worldwide organization that helps create resources that keep things accessible to people. They define compliance as having a contrast score of 4.5 or higher. What that means is that the difference between the background color and the text color is at least a 4.5, ideally higher. Now here's a visual example of what contrast scores look like. So if you look over here on the left, you can see some higher contrast scores. So we've got like 11.01, down here we've got 12.05, dark background, light text, or light background, dark text, high contrast. But if we look over here on the right side, these are really low contrast scores, and you might be able to read them, but they're probably a little bit difficult. And if the text was a lot smaller, it would be much more difficult. Contrast score of 1.11 and 1.68, those are well below the 4.5 recommendations. Now, every pair of colors has a unique contrast score, and if you're working with a pair of colors, those contrast scores are going to be the same, whether one of them's the background or one of them's the text. So here's the same pair of colors, just inverted text and background colors, and they both have a contrast score of 15.32. Very, very good. And contrast scores can range anywhere from 1 to 21. So 1 would be like the exact same color on top of the exact same color, meaning there's no contrast. And 21 is a contrast score of pure black and pure white, which is kind of fun. Pure black and pure white have the highest contrast scores, which is why we see them so often. Now, a question I get all the time is, how do you quantify color contrast? And I've actually made you some tools to help make this a lot easier for you. The first tool I've made is called the Color Contrast Checker. This is a completely free tool that you can use to check the contrast levels of any two colors. So I can literally just choose any two random colors and click Compare Contrast, and it's going to show me the contrast ratio. And I can play around with it until I get a contrast ratio that I like. So I can lighten colors, darken colors, do whatever I want to do, but this will test any two colors. But if you want to test more than two colors at once, I've made a tool that will help you do that. It's called the Color Palette Tester, and it allows you to add as many colors as you want, and you can test them all in one quick instance. So instead of having to test them individually as pairs, you can test all the colors in your palette, and you can click Show Colors to view all of the contrast scores, or you can click Show Compliant Colors, and it will only show you the color pairings that have a contrast score of at least 4.5. I use this tool every single day as a designer because it helps me ensure that my entire palette has some high contrast pairings in it. Now let's talk about what a balanced color palette actually looks like. A balanced color palette has at least two colors, And I say this because even after doing this for so many years, I hear someone say like, oh, I just want to have one color in my palette. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but no palette in the history of ever has only had one color. This is not a palette. This is a single color. You need to have multiple colors in your palette just to be able to use it. This is a palette. Having 2 colors or more is a color palette. Now, a balanced color palette also has a mix of light and dark colors. This is not a good mix of light and dark colors. They're all very similar. They all actually have the same level of saturation. There is no contrast. You would not have any high contrast pairs between these colors. But this is a balanced color palette. It's got a mix of contrast levels so that if we were to put it into the color palette tester, we would actually have pairs that we could use with a 4.5 or higher contrast score. Now let's talk about how to use the color spectrum to build a balanced palette. This is where that science is going to come in. I posted a video a few days ago talking about hue, saturation, and luminosity. And if you haven't watched it yet, go watch that because it's going to cover a lot of these topics. And it's going to make you more familiar with the spectrum. But as a quick refresher, the color spectrum can be broken up into these 9 components. So we can describe the luminosity, either light, medium, or dark, and then we can describe the saturation, meaning muted, midtone, or bright. So no matter what hue we're talking about, any color in the spectrum, we can split it up into this 9-section grid. So if I say I want a medium midtone color, I'm talking about something in this range. Or if I say I want a dark muted color, something over here. So this is a spectrum that we can use to our advantage when we're trying to balance color palettes. And the way we can do that is by making sure that we have at least one light color and at least one dark color. And I've outlined generally where you can find these colors using the hue spectrum tool. So to find your light color, you want to choose at least one color from these purple sections. So this is not like a fine, hard cutoff line. This is more general. But if you have something from this area of the spectrum, you're going to have a light color in your palette. Likewise, if you have something from this section, you're going to have a dark color that you can use in your palette. Now, these colors don't have to come from the same hue. So it doesn't have to be like, okay, a light version of the blue and a dark version of the blue. It just means that you want to have something from here and something from here. You need at least one of each in your full color palette. So here's what that looks like in real life. Let's take these 2 colors. Let's pretend that we want a 2-color brand color palette, and we're just going to use these 2 colors, this beige and this purple. Here's what they look like in their individual hue spectrums. So we're going to start with this beige over here on the left. That color sits right here. So it's in this light muted section, and the purple sits right here in the medium bright section. Now the contrast ratio between these 2 colors is 6.90, so it has high enough contrast to be able to be used on a brand or website. Now let's try this pair, this pink and this brown. The pink sits right here in the hue spectrum. It's in the light mid-tone section, sort of on the left side, a little bit more towards muted. And the brown sits right at the bottom of the medium bright section. So it's almost dark bright, but it's a little bit more towards medium bright. And the contrast ratio of this is 6.11. Now let's try this pair. We're going to try this seafoam green and this deep teal. It's actually a really cute color combo. So this seafoam green is definitely a light color. This is like gold standard for having a light color in your palette. It's almost all the way to the top towards white. It's in the light muted section. And then the teal is somewhere between dark midtone and dark bright. So it's right down here. And the contrast ratio is 11.33. And you can kind of see how that's a bigger contrast ratio than the other colors because this light color is so far northwest. It's so far to the top left of the spectrum. If it were closer to here, that contrast ratio would be smaller. And that brings me to my next point, which is that the closer your 2 colors get to one another on the hue spectrum, the smaller the contrast ratio. So I'm actually going to show you what that looks like in real life because it's easier to visualize when you can see it. So here are 2 colors, and here's the contrast ratio, 3.14. The reason that that contrast ratio is lower is because these colors are really pulling towards one another. The closer colors are either to each other or towards the middle of the hue spectrum, like the closer they're pulling towards one another, the smaller that contrast ratio. But it's super, super fixable. All we have to do is just move one of them further away, or both if you really want. But if I move this pink just a little bit further to the left towards this light muted section, our contrast ratio jumps up to 5.32, which means it's suddenly an accessible color pairing. So it's really easy to fix a palette. You just have to know where to move colors or adjust them. Now I want to warn you about the danger zone. And what is the danger zone? You might be asking yourself. The danger zone is the central area of the hue spectrum. You don't want your only light and your only dark color to exist in this square, because if you do, the contrast levels are going to be very, very iffy. It's too close to the middle. Everything will be too familiar and too close to one another, and you're risking not having any high contrast pairings. Now let's talk about how to actually build a balanced color palette, because it's completely possible, it's easy, it's fun, I love doing it, and I'm just gonna show you how to do it in 4 very simple steps. The first thing you wanna do is you wanna choose the aesthetic or vibe. So you wanna find a design style that works for your project, you wanna make a mood board, you wanna figure out the general aesthetic that you're going for. Then, you want to add any colors that you want, as long as they fit the vibe. So if I was going for a retro 70s vibe, I might have pulled colors from a color mood board. You can choose 2 colors, you can choose 10 colors, you can choose 20 colors. I'm not here to restrict you on how many colors are in your palette, but you want to just add any colors that you want. Then you want to check to make sure that you have at least 1 light color and at least 1 dark color. So in my first go with this palette, I had a couple light colors over here on the left. I had a few options, but I had totally forgotten, well, I didn't really forget, but for purposes of this video, I had forgotten to add in a dark color. So I knew in step 3 that I had to check to make sure I had something light and something dark. And then finally, you'll want to check the contrast scores of your palette to make sure that you have high contrast pairings. So I just quickly added all those colors to the color palette tester and was able to find all of my high contrast pairings, which is so great to have on hand. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you had fun. I hope that you learned something. I love making content, tools, and resources for this community. So if there's anything that you want to learn more about, please comment, add your questions in the comment section. And it would really mean a lot if you would like and subscribe. Thanks for hanging out.